The Whispering Shadows. It started with a whisper. At first, Michael thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Moving to a small town in the middle of nowhere had been a decision made in haste. He needed a fresh start, away from the chaos of the city, the noise, the past he wanted to leave behind. But what he didn't know was that the house he had just moved into had a past of its own. The house stood alone at the end of a desolate road, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow the light. The air smelled damp, and an eerie silence lingered. It was the kind of place that had stories attached to it, stories no one wanted to talk about. Some said strange things happened there. Others claimed they had seen figures in the windows long after the last owner had vanished. The first night was uneventful. Michael unpacked a few boxes, set up his bed, and decided to get some sleep. But as soon as he turned off the lights, he heard it, a soft whisper coming from the hallway. His body tensed. He listened closely, but the whispering stopped. Maybe it was just the house settling, he told himself. The next night, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, closer. He could almost make out the words, but not quite. He turned on the lights, searching the house, but he found nothing. That's when he noticed something odd. The mirror in the hallway seemed fogged up, as if someone had just breathed on it. A chill ran down his spine. On closer inspection, faint smudges appeared on the glass, almost forming letters before fading away. Determined to get some answers, Michael started digging into the history of the house. The townspeople were hesitant to talk, but an old librarian finally relented. She told him about the previous owner, a recluse named Mr. Holloway, who had vanished without a trace decades ago. Some believed he had gone insane, others whispered about dark rituals conducted in the house. But one thing everyone agreed on, no one who stayed there lasted long. That night, Michael set up a camera in the hallway, determined to capture whatever was happening. The whispers returned, growing louder. This time, they formed words. "Leave, now." Michael's breath hitched. He grabbed his phone to check the footage. His hands trembled as he watched the recording. There, in the dim light, a shadow moved across the hallway. But it wasn't just a shadow. It had shape. It had eyes. And it was staring right at the camera. The worst part? The timestamp showed that it had been standing there for hours, unmoving, watching. Michael knew he had to leave. But as he rushed to pack his things, the whispering turned into something else, laughter. Low, guttural laughter that seemed to come from all around him. The lights flickered. The walls seemed to breathe. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, as if the darkness itself was alive. The air turned ice cold, and suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own. Michael struggled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter grew louder, morphing into distorted whispers, filling his ears with unintelligible words. Then, he saw it. From the corner of his eye, a figure emerged from the darkness, its shape barely human, its eyes two hollow voids reflecting nothing but malice. It reached out, long fingers twitching, and as it touched his shoulder, Michael felt an unbearable cold seep into his skin. Michael screamed, his voice lost beneath the cacophony of voices around him. The walls pulsed as if alive, the ceiling sagging with an unseen weight. He felt himself being pulled backward, his feet dragging against the wooden floor. A force stronger than anything he had ever known was pulling him into the shadows. Then, darkness. The next morning, Michael's car was found abandoned at the edge of town. His house was empty. No signs of struggle. No note. Just silence. And on the mirror in the hallway, faintly written as if by an unseen hand, were the words, "We told you." But Michael was not gone. Not entirely. His whispers now joined the others, echoing through the halls, warning the next unfortunate soul who dared to call the house their home. The Whispering Walls, a true scary story to fall asleep to. Story number 2. Have you ever felt like you're not alone in your own home? Like the walls around you are alive, listening, waiting? Tonight, I'll tell you a story that will make you question every creak, every whisper, and every shadow in your room. This is a true story, one that happened to a woman named Sarah. A story of terror that began with a simple housewarming gift, a gift that would change her life forever. Sarah had always dreamed of living in a quiet, peaceful place. So, when she found the old Victorian house nestled in the countryside, she knew it was perfect. The house was charming, with tall windows that let in streams of sunlight, wooden floors that creaked with history, and a cozy fireplace that promised warm nights. But there was something off about the house. The previous owners had left in a hurry, leaving behind odd trinkets and furniture. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. She was too excited to start her new life. One of the items left behind was an antique mirror. It was tall, almost reaching the ceiling, with a carved wooden frame that seemed to twist and turn like vines. The mirror had an old, faded inscription at the bottom, but Sarah couldn't quite make it out. She loved the mirror and decided to place it in her bedroom. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint whisper. It was so soft, she thought it was the wind rustling through the trees outside. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were coming from the mirror. Sarah. Sarah. She sat up, her heart pounding. The room was dark, but the mirror seemed to glow faintly. She told herself it was just her imagination and tried to sleep. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Sarah would wake up to find her belongings moved. Her favorite necklace, which she always left on the dresser, was found hanging from the mirror. The temperature in the house would drop suddenly, and she'd see shadows moving in the corners of her vision. One night, she decided to confront her fears. She stood in front of the mirror and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the mirror began to fog up, as if someone was breathing on it. Words appeared, written in the fog, "Let me out." Sarah stumbled back, terrified. She threw a blanket over the mirror and left the room. But that night, she heard scratching. It was coming from the mirror. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the mirror and carried it to the attic, locking it away. But the whispers followed her. Desperate for answers, Sarah researched the history of the house. She discovered that the previous owner, a woman named Margaret, had disappeared mysteriously. The police had found no trace of her, but neighbors claimed they'd heard whispers coming from the house before she vanished. Sarah also learned that the mirror was no ordinary mirror. It was said to be a portal, a gateway for spirits trapped between worlds. The whispers were Margaret's voice, begging to be freed. One night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She uncovered the mirror and said, "Margaret, if you're there, show me what you want." The mirror's surface rippled like water. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the glass. Suddenly, a cold hand grabbed her wrist and pulled her in. Sarah found herself in a dark, endless void. Margaret stood before her, her face pale and twisted with anger. "You shouldn't have come here," Margaret said. "Now you'll take my place." Sarah fought to escape, but the void was closing in. Just as she thought it was over, she woke up in her bed. The mirror was gone, and the room was silent. But as she looked around, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the window wasn't hers. It was Margaret's, smiling back at her. Sarah never found the mirror again. But sometimes, late at night, she hears whispers. They are softer now, almost comforting. But she knows the truth. Margaret is still there, waiting. And one day, she'll come back. So, the next time you hear a whisper in the dark, don't ignore it. It might be someone, or something, trying to reach you. The Forgotten Lullaby, story number 3. Eleanor had never been to her grandmother's house before. It stood alone on a misty hill, its wooden frame creaking with the weight of time. The town had whispered about it for years, calling it cursed, but Eleanor's mother never spoke a word. When her grandmother passed, the house was left to Eleanor, an inheritance she never wanted. From the moment she stepped inside, she felt something was off. The air smelled of old books and something else, something stale. The furniture remained untouched, as if time had frozen the house in place. But the strangest thing was the music box on the mantel, its lid slightly ajar. It played a lullaby so faint, she almost mistook it for the wind. That first night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The house groaned, whispering secrets through the walls. Then came the humming, a soft, melodic tune, the same lullaby from the music box. Her heart pounded. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight, but as she scanned the room, the humming stopped. The air turned thick, suffocating. Something was watching. Determined to understand the house's secrets, Eleanor visited the town's library the next day. The elderly librarian paled when she mentioned her grandmother's house. She pulled out an old newspaper clipping, "Tragedy on Hollow Hill, child vanishes without a trace." The photo showed a young girl standing by the house. Beneath it, a name, Matilda. That night, the lullaby returned, but this time, Eleanor heard words between the notes. "Find me." The temperature plummeted, and her breath came out in misty puffs. The music box played on its own, the lid rattling violently. The house seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Summoning her courage, she followed the sound down the hall to the attic. The door, which had been locked earlier, was now slightly open. Inside, dust danced in the moonlight. The air was heavy with something unseen, something waiting. At the center of the room sat an old wooden crib. Eleanor stepped closer, her pulse drumming in her ears. The crib rocked, ever so slightly. Inside, beneath a dusty blanket, was a porcelain doll with glassy, lifeless eyes. Clutched in its hand was a locket. With trembling fingers, Eleanor pried it open. Inside was a tiny photograph of her grandmother as a child, standing beside Matilda. A sudden gust of wind slammed the attic door shut. Eleanor spun around, and that's when she saw her. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, head tilted, humming the lullaby. The figure took a step forward, revealing hollow, sorrowful eyes. "You forgot me." Matilda's voice was barely above a whisper, but the pain in it was deafening. The walls trembled. The crib began to rock violently. Eleanor's mind screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Matilda reached out, her fingers ice-cold against Eleanor's wrist. Images flooded her mind, her grandmother as a child, playing with Matilda, then hiding as a man loomed over them. A struggle. A scream. Silence. And then, Matilda being buried beneath the attic floorboards. Eleanor gasped, yanking herself free. The floor beneath the crib creaked ominously. She dropped to her knees, pulling away the old wooden planks. Beneath them, she found a tiny skeleton wrapped in a tattered blanket. The lullaby stopped. Matilda stared at Eleanor, tears in her hollow eyes. The air around them grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. As Eleanor reached for the doll, Matilda began to fade, her form dissolving into the soft glow of morning light filtering through the attic window. "Thank you." The whisper came, and then she was gone. The next day, Eleanor arranged for Matilda's remains to be buried properly. The house, once filled with sorrow, felt lighter, the shadows retreating. As she packed to leave, she noticed the music box on the mantel. It was silent. But this time, Eleanor didn't feel afraid.